Now, in the United States, the government remains shut down for a third consecutive week. Why? Because Republicans and Democrats are still at an impasse over a key funding bill. Today, it failed to advance in the Senate for a 10th time, and the stalemate is already having reverberations on the economy, travel, museums, and the payroll of federal workers. The Trump administration has now been temporarily blocked from laying off thousands of government employees. A judge called it politically motivated. Democratic Senator from Virginia, Mark Warner, joins Michelle Martin now to discuss how mass layoffs are impacting his state and about his fears of a looming healthcare crisis.
Thanks, Christiane. Senator Mark Warner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, obviously, we called you. One of the reasons that we called you is that we're into, I guess, the third week of the government shutdown by now. The president is threatening to lay off federal workers. It appears that there seems to be some arrangement to pay military personnel, at least. Virginia is disproportionately affected by this. I mean, you have a significant percentage of the workforce, the non-farm workforce, are federal employees, and you have the second largest number of military personnel of any state in the country after California. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what are your constituents telling you about this? What are you hearing from them?
Well, first of all, I'm glad the military is getting paid. But remarkably, at least at this stage of this process, I'm hearing from federal workers pretty consistently that they feel like they have been traumatized by Trump administration. They feel that Russ Vought, the OMB director, who Trump himself has called the Grim Reaper, is really coming after federal workers on an unfair basis. Matter of fact, the president has no greater ability during a shutdown to fire workers than in traditional times. So they feel very much victimized. They want us to push back. We also believe very strongly that, the idea of that healthcare cliff that's not going to come at the end of the year, that literally comes November 1st when people get their increased healthcare costs and will have to buy in the marketplace. We don't have the luxury of waiting till the end of the year. Put on top of the fact that, the president of the United States has only sat down with the Democratic leadership one time on this whole issue. I know the president's been running around the world, and some of these things he's done have been successful. I commend him on that. But the idea that he is not taking this shutdown seriously and sitting down and trying to work this out, I think is a great failure of leadership. And we could actually do both. We could deal with the healthcare crisis, get the workforce back in. And frankly, at the end of the day, the president continuing to ratchet up threats, if anything, I think makes not only the Democrats, but it makes the federal workforce more angry and more frustrated.
Do you think that this it creates a wedge, actually, between civilians and military personnel getting paid and civilians are not?
I hope not. I hope that the president of the United States would recognize that all of these federal workers contribute to the safety of our country, and whether it's in putting their lives on the line, or for that matter, inspecting the milk and the food that we drink or eat, that protects Americans as well. And having those folks not paid isn't fair or right. We have said for some time, this was an imminently preventable crisis. We knew the healthcare costs were going up. The administration knew. We've got clinics closing already in my state because of this fear of this healthcare cliff. Let's do these together. And there is a lack of trust, because so far we've seen, even when we reach agreement with this administration, we've seen the OMB director arbitrarily come in after the fact and arbitrarily choose which program to fund or not to fund. That's just not the way the law ought to operate.
So let's talk about the substance of this for people, because everybody isn't following this as closely as you are, and certainly as people who are closely connected to the federal workforce are. The immediate issue, the Republicans argue that the Democrats are being recalcitrant and not passing what they call a clean continuing resolution, which keeps funding at the same levels as the previous budget. The Democrats say that the issue here is the expiration of these subsidies for people who buy health care on the Affordable Care Act marketplace. Without these subsidies, the cost to the buyer is going to increase precipitously. And that, as you pointed out, the timeline is coming up to for these insurance premiums to be priced out. People are going to have to make decisions for their sort of budget. But in essence, both sides are sort of pointing fingers at each other. So can you just...
So one of the things you just said, I got to take issue with.
Go ahead.
The idea that this is a normal CR just isn't the case. Historically, and we've passed a bunch of these, the Democrats and the Republicans sit down together, work out their deal, and then say, we're going to take a time out to finish them. None of that took place. Usually it involves the White House as well. The Republicans felt like we don't need Democrats at all, so we're going to box them out, number one. Number two, we've seen in the past when we've gotten close to these kind of shutdown circumstances, which are always an awful option, the President of the United States engaged. Biden engaged repeatedly. Actually, when McCarthy was the speaker, he used the speakership very much to his advantage in getting Biden to the table. Trump has had one meeting and then kind of blown it off. And the immediacy of the healthcare bite is such that people are already getting these notices. My fear is the Republicans want to not acknowledge the costs going up. They're afraid as Americans see these notices coming out, which will happen more in late October than in early October, Americans are going to across the country revolt. And the issue here again is it's not just the 24 million Americans who buy their health insurance through these marketplaces, but if we drive millions of Americans out of the healthcare system, and our healthcare system isn't perfect to start with, and drive them all back into the emergency room, that is going to collapse the healthcare system. Everybody's healthcare rates are going to go up. We want to avoid that. We can avoid that. But you got to get in the room and talk about these things. I don't think it's an unreasonable ask to say, let's sit down. And frankly, at this stage of the game, the one thing we do know is the Republican leadership has no say in this. End of the day, this is all going to be decided, at least on the Republican side, by Donald Trump. So we need the president's engagement. We need to sit down. Reasonable people can work this out, particularly the president coming off of a very successful effort in the Middle East. Let's see those make a deal skills work back here at home and avoid this healthcare crisis and get our federal workforce back to and get them paid.
So you've laid out the substance of the argument. You have to assume that the White House and the Republicans believe that the politics are on their side in this, that they are willing to risk people either being unable to afford health insurance, dropping out of the system altogether, et cetera. Why are they wrong?
Well, all of the data I've seen so far indicates that Americans overwhelmingly don't want the healthcare system to explode. Now, again, that's today. Who knows in a few weeks? But I think in a few weeks, the circumstance gets worse for the president because these hypothetical price increases, people are going to get the letters and go, holy crap, my rates went from $800 a month to $2,100 a month, which a couple in Roanoke in my state would receive if they make, roughly $80,000 a year. That is a dramatic increase. And I don't know how that improves for the president and his party, other than the fact that it's going to make more people say, hey, we cannot afford this dramatic increase.
The argument that the Republicans are making is that voting for the CR, the continuing resolution, is a way to buy time to have those kinds of conversations. Why are they wrong?
They're wrong because we've gone through CRs already. We knew this cliff was coming, and there was no engagement. We're operating right now under a CR. Well, actually, it expired at the end of the fiscal year, but we passed a CR back in March. There was plenty of time to negotiate this. I feel like there is this sense that the president feels so emboldened that he basically can blow off Congress. And one of the things that I've been surprised that my Republican colleagues haven't risen up and said, hey, we actually got to have a say on this as well. But frankly, there's not much of a Republican Party. There's a Trump party. And if there was real interest in negotiating on this, why didn't it happen before September 30th? And so taking a promise from somebody who hasn't kept their word so far, even when there was the CR in place and they've arbitrarily picked which programs to fund, how you go into that circumstance where people, fool me once, it's my fault, fool me twice, I'm a fool. And we've seen that kind of activity from this OMB and from this president in terms of cutting back on programs that were actually agreed on. There's not a lot of trust, as we know. Let's get the president in the room. Let's make this deal. I think you get a handshake in a single day. The details on how you extend the ACA subsidies will take some time. But I think you could get to a deal and get this government reopened right away. But it's not going to be based on some future promise to negotiate when we've seen a lack of trust, a lack of follow through from the president on so many items.
The irony being that, according to an analysis by the KFF Health News, the majority of buyers of these policies under the Affordable Care Act are actually in Republican states.
Absolutely. They're all from states that didn't expand Medicaid. And again, this is just on the Affordable Care Act. We've already seen the $1 trillion hit that has been taken to Medicaid, which, again, curiously enough, our Republican friends didn't have kick in until after next year's midterm elections, where, again, about 11 million additional Americans will lose their health care coverage.
You all have private conversations. I understand that publicly there are no sort of discussions going on, but I assume you have side conversations. You have people you've known for years. You've served. This is like your third term. You've served with people for years. Private conversations? Any private conversations going on? When you point this out, what do they say?
I've been part of every bipartisan group in the Senate in the last decade. I have great Republican friends who I know, want to get this resolved. But in today's Washington, no Republican senator or congressman, with the exception of one or two, will go against the president. They are not going to move in any serious way unless the president says so. So the idea that we could, in the classic way, the Senate would work its will with Republicans and Democrats coming to a conclusion and then go to the president, that's just not the reality of the world we live in today. Donald Trump controls every action of the Republican Senate. There is no independent actors. There are no independent actors. So no matter what good faith conversations are taking place, without the president's involvement, I don't know how we get this resolved.
But I guess I'm curious. Here's where I'm asking you to speculate. President Trump is very attentive to people in his constituencies that he perceives as being part of his constituencies, his base, as it were. So I guess the question becomes, why would he be willing to allow people to go without health insurance or see these premiums rise, at least the cost to the buyer rise as precipitously as it is projected they will? Do you have a theory about that?
I only know what was reported from the one meeting where the Democrats met with President Trump. And it seemed, at least at that point, the president was not aware of how dramatic this cliff would be at the end of October. I think he's probably got to be more informed now, but he's obviously been focused on the circumstances in the Middle East and Gaza. He's had been focused on other items. I hope and pray he comes back focused on this crisis at hand here at home. We're not going to make America great if we destroy an already challenged healthcare system. But so far, that hasn't come to pass. I mean, if the president sat down and had 2 or 3 sessions and didn't get to a deal, I think his position would be strengthened. Not urging him to come in and be adamant about not opening negotiation, but the ask that's being made is, let's sit down in a room and try to work this out. Isn't that a reasonable approach? Aren't you, Mr. Trump, supposedly the world's best deal maker? And his refusal to do so, I agree with you. I don't get it.
The Republicans, up to and including the vice president, have been arguing that what Democrats are really after is to subsidize health care for illegal immigrants.
That is factually wrong.
What are the facts of that?
Let me finish.
Mm-hmm.
That is factually wrong. Mm-hmm. I would hope the vice president would know the law. I know he didn't spend much time in the Senate, but the law prohibits any federal dollars going in Medicaid, in the Affordable Care Act, in any other program to undocumented people in this country. He should know it. To state otherwise is a lie. And it is, I think, frankly, disrespectful to the 24 million Americans who are about to lose their health care coverage.
And the basis of that is what? As I understand it, the basis of that is that emergency rooms, as you just pointed out, have to treat all comers. Is that the basis of the logic of that?
Right. That is a law called Intella that says if you show up at the emergency room, even if you don't have coverage, even if we don't know who you are, we're not going to let you bleed out on the floor in the emergency room. I think that is the law of most civilized nations. And the irony here is if you are going to take these 24 million Americans and drive them out of the system because they can't afford it and have them show up at the emergency room, all you're really doing is putting additional burden on the emergency room. That's going to also drive up healthcare costs for the other Americans who've got traditional private health insurance, because that, for the most part, comes in as what's called uncompensated care. The hospital has to eat it. That means it's going to drive up rates for everybody else. Some of this is just plain math 101. And the fact that the vice president is making this baseless, false argument, they have assumed for a while that there's huge amounts of their presumption is all of these programs must be riddled with graft, even in states that are controlled by Republicans, if somehow non-Americans are getting this assistance. I don't believe that is the case. And it would be obviously a great black eye for those Republican-controlled states where the disproportionate number of people are who are buying through the marketplaces. But the law is 100% explicitly clear. And again, I am disappointed the vice president doesn't know the law of the country.
Do you see any way forward here? I understand that you specifically on just getting to an agreement, your argument is, as your other colleagues are on the Democratic side, that the president has to get involved, get in the room and sort of and work it out.
Well, I also say, let me just quickly add, I don't think there's any Republican senator I've talked to who hasn't privately said to me, Mark, we got to get Trump in this. We're not going to do anything without Trump's approval.
But substantively, do you see a way forward that you could support? Because,
yes,
there are Republicans who have been consistent. They just say, you know what, the subsidies are too expensive. Like, I've had conversations with Republican senators, and some of them are consistent. It's just too expensive. We can't afford it.
Yes. I see path forward substantively that avoid the cliff. And if there are reforms that need to be put in place, put us on a path to get those reforms, avoid the immediate cliff of November, put reforms in place. And frankly, one of the things that I've offered to some of my Republican friends, why don't we put into the debate as well? Because of President Trump's tariffs, many of our farming community, particularly in the Midwest, some of those same Republican states are getting creamed because China's no longer buying soybeans. We're going to need a $10, $15, $20, $25 billion assistance package for the agriculture community across the country. Why that isn't introduced into this conversation, I'm not sure why either, because, we're going to get this done, and I believe it will get done, and then the president will come back and say, oh, I forgot we need another bucket of money. Why we wouldn't go ahead and put that into the conversation right now and get it all resolved and actually show the American people, and for that matter, the rest of the world, we can still function with appropriate checks and balances. That would be a win for everyone, I think, including the president.
Senator Mark Warner, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you so much.